My father Wallace was born inland, here in this Northern Irish linen village of Upperlands, and neither of his parents was particularly a sailor, and yet for some reason he always yearned for the ocean, to master the waves. He began sailing here on the dams that were constructed around the linen mill in order to provide power and water for the linen process. So this very spot is where he would have begun his first very amateurish experiments in sailing, in a dinghy which his father bought him, and his poor sister Jill, who was a toddler, was involved in various rather hair-raising experiments in self-instruction in sailing. But of course, even as a child, Wallace sensed that sailing on the dam was rather tame compared with what he ultimately dreamed of doing. For some reason, he always had an absolute inner longing to be on the ocean, to be mastering the ocean wave. So in the late 40s, he settled down to a lifetime's work in the family linen business, and it was more and more important to him to get away at weekends and in every moment of free time to the ocean, to the Irish and Scottish coasts, and to have some liberation, if you like, from the fairly regimented sort of life that he was experiencing back here in Upperlands. So from the late 40s onwards, he was sailing the Irish and Scottish coasts in small wooden sailing boats, teaching himself how to sail the ocean, if you like, and he developed an enormous store of knowledge. He was really a pioneer of recreational sailing on the Irish coast. One of his early ports of call was Cardiff, where his cousins, the Mills family, lived. And they soon realised just how deep his knowledge was.
I think that anyone sailing with Wallace Clark would feel quite safe. I know there's a quote in some of his books there, and I think it sums him up someplace, that when he was coming into some harbour down in Kerry or someplace, and the locals were astonished that he could get in this difficult way through these rocks and all, and they told him when they arrived that you were very lucky to get in through there. You'd have needed to have the manual to get into that port. And he replied that he wrote the manual.
Wallace could strike up a friendship with anybody who shared his love of the sea and who shared his sense of the sea as a place to be loved and, in a sense, mastered, but also feared and respected. Another cousin in that part of the world was his co-author, Ros Harvey, and she remembers how very well known he was in the remotest parts of the west of Ireland.
They loved him. They remembered him from years. On Inishturk once we landed. I went for a walk to experience the island, and I came across a cottage. There was a man up on the roof, slating his roof, and it had been very misty and I'd semi-lost. And he said, "Where have you come from?" And I said, "From the harbour, off a yacht." "Which yacht?" So I said, "Oh, it belongs to Wallace Clark." And he slid down the roof, leapt off, bundled me into his car, and said, "I haven't seen Mr. Clark since the previous galley, 63, was it?
Yes.
And I've never forgotten him.
Yes, wonderful. Yes.
And he drove me down back to the harbour.
Yes.
Came on board. Wallace, of course, remembered him.
I always remember when Wallace came in, he mixed with everybody. That was what I liked about him. As I grew older and got to know him better. And, he wouldn't have his foot on the pier in Bonagee. He'd be saying, "I must go up and see Mickey Dennis," or "I must go and see Dennis Monagle," or Mickey Monagle, and how is he and how is Joe Jackie getting on. And they would all talk of him just as fondly, and they'd be waiting on Big Clark. That's what they used to call him, Big Clark. But they would talk about tides and fishing and stuff like that, and nets and all those kind of things, and sails, of course, because the older fishermen it was all sailing, and the older days. And
one of Wallace's closest maritime friendships was struck when he was towing his boat over a mountain road and ran into the architect, Liam McCormick.
Liam was driving over Glen Shane, the big mountain over there, and he saw this yacht outside a pub in the top of the mountain called the Ponderosa. And he immediately got out of the car and in there, and they found that they really had so much in common, and then they realised they'd got the same bit of sea in common.
What all these friends recognised was a particular style of seamanship. He was more concerned with his crew's safety than his own.
Wallace Clark had a great love of the sea. He was a very considerable seafarer in that he didn't take serious risks in the sea. I would have hated to go to sea with a person who was very, very gung-ho and head out in all weathers and, oh, to hell with it, we'll beat this storm. Wallace wasn't like that. When Wallace took a risk, it was a calculated risk. When you were with Wallace Clark, at any time you always felt safe. Wallace inspired that in people. They knew he would not take chances with their lives, and that was part of his appeal. He was a great guy.
And yet, in his own very private relationship with the sea, there was a fatalistic streak.
He didn't believe in things like life jackets, and, the sea owned him once he was in a boat. And if he fell out or if he drowned, it was the sea's prize.
One of the places where he evolved as a seafarer, from an accident-prone young man to an eminent authority on the sea and on maritime history, was the island nearest his home, Rathlin. My father used to tell the story of how on his first trip to Rathlin he came a cropper on the reef called the Bow, which is a bit embarrassing, and I suppose over time he learnt these waters and he learnt how to avoid the various reefs and how to avoid the various tide rips. So you probably observed him becoming a more and more skilled seafarer.
Oh yes, and if you look out at the Rock Armour there now, that was the reef.
Do you think that his writing might have played a part in getting a harbour for this place?
well, he certainly made an awareness of Rathlin. He did play this part over it.
Now, in the days when he was an impulsive young bachelor, he used to change sailing boat quite often, but he had one particularly beloved boat in the early 50s. That was a 27-footer called Carew. Carew's arrival at a port in Donegal always caused some excitement.
The greatest excitement was being at Banagee in the summer, where we used to live in two little houses, seeing him sailing round Dunmore Head, and we would race on to the end of the pier and wait for a good half hour till he arrived.
And then finally, in 1956, he acquired the boat that would be really the love of his life in maritime terms, Wild Goose. Here's a famous photograph of the boat with two masts, the mizzen mast and the main mast. A huge wooden mast in those days, so you can see the boat as she was under Wallace Clark's ownership. So Wild Goose, from Wallace's point of view, began life as a vessel in which he simply had lots of fun and lots of time with his young family, splashing about in the waters of Ireland and Scotland, and then later on the French Riviera after his sail through the French canals. And his first mate and trusted companion on these early voyages was my mother June.
I was so admiring of June because she managed to look so elegant and crew so well, whereas I'd be just shivering somewhere down below. But she's a marvellous woman.
But later on, Wild Goose would have some extraordinary adventures, because Wallace and his son Miles, it's my brother Miles, jointly accomplished an extraordinary historic voyage in Wild Goose, a circumnavigation of Europe. Wallace's friends remember Wild Goose both as a family pleasure craft, but also as a vessel that led the Clark family into much more exotic waters.
Wild Goose was very important because that boat to me represented freedom and history of this area. So I loved it very much.
Owning such a venerable boat seemed to deepen Wallace's interest in places and periods of history that were quite remote from his own.
But he also wanted to find the history of the sea, the history of the area around here and other places, even as far as Russia.
In the winter of 1991, Wallace and Miles and their cousin Stephen Clark undertook a massive refit of Wild Goose for a voyage to the Russian Arctic which no Western yacht had ever made.
So I think Wallace was a tremendous enthusiast, but also had a marvellous imagination, and his love of Hornblower sparked his imagination. He could see Wild Goose on this wonderful voyage. I think it was a source of some disappointment that he wasn't doing it himself. I think, but he really threw himself behind trying to organise the thing correctly.
The first leg of the voyage, a stormy night sail from Ireland to the Outer Hebrides, turned out to be the hardest.
Yes, we set off in the early morn on a rainy, wet, misty morning down the River Bann about 6:30 or so, with the boat absolutely covered in bits and pieces of most important gear, that cameras and boxes of film and all the bits and pieces that were necessary for a trip through a country where Miles was going to have to be totally self-sufficient. So finding stowage space for all of that in a boat that really had been designed for family weekends, well, it was quite a challenge.
Wallace and Stephen accompanied Miles only as far as Scotland, but on their watch, Wild Goose's resilience was severely tested.
The wind rose from the south, and we were running before the wind just with a jib and a mizzen to start off with. And then as the wind rose, we furled the mizzen and just a jib and the engine ticking over. We headed a course of due north, magnetic, and the waves were coming up behind us and slushing down the deck of the boat.
4 months later, Wallace's hard work was rewarded as he was able to rejoin Wild Goose as she sailed through the Bosphorus.
Wallace had said to me that it was one of the greatest meetings of his life to stand and wait for and watch Wild Goose approach him across the Black Sea with Miles at the helm, having achieved this wonderful voyage all the way through the Russias, and coming his old favourite boat of so many years' ownership, to see it approach him out of the middle of this dark lake.
But perhaps dear old Wild Goose was tired after all that exotic voyaging. She did indeed see some very unexpected places, including the ocean floor at the mouth of the River Bann, as a result of an accident one night in the summer of 1998.
I came across this message from Wallace, who informed me that Wild Goose sadly had been lost at the Barmouth, and that if there was an interest in the Maritime Heritage Group to take on the Wild Goose on the seabed, then we, between the insurance company and ourselves and the Royal Engineers, that we would do the salvage operation as a community project.
By the time she was salvaged, Wild Goose was already a venerable old boat of 62 years. But Wallace's other passion involved delving much further into the past and remaking some of the great voyages of history. Two of the great moments in his life, really, consisted of exercises in maritime reconstruction, of voyages between Ireland and Scotland. The first of those projects of reconstruction was in 1963, when he undertook a voyage from Derry to Iona in the wake of a great Celtic saint, Columba or Columkill. And his co-organiser was a distinguished churchman, Canon John Barry.
My father, Canon John Barry, rector of Hillsborough, was regarded as the sort of spiritual leader of the Curragh crew. It was Wallace who was very much the skipper of the crew, and he took basically everything to do with the Curragh. He was the most marvellous man. I think Wallace deferred to my father's spiritual leadership. My father was more than happy to defer to Wallace Clark's maritime leadership. Wallace was an extraordinary man. He was truly happy when he was on board a boat, when he was in a bit of a seaway. He understood the sea, and in a funny way, I think the sea understood him.
And for Wallace and John Barry, the Curragh was an intensely spiritual moment.
Something happened that it became an immensely profound spiritual experience for them all, and each one of them, I know, those who are still alive, they were all left, never the same again. They were transformed by it, and the Curragh voyage is was always a part of their minds that they could return to. And I think Wallace and my father both felt during that time that they had come truly alive, and they had experienced within their souls a kind of spiritual depth and profundity and a richness that they never experienced again, and it never left them. It was just a wonderful time for them.
The other big project of maritime reconstruction was in 1991, when he oversaw the building and then the sailing of a galley, a wooden galley, of the kind that would have plied the waters of Ireland and Scotland in medieval times. And this time the maiden voyage was from the west of Ireland, from Westport and Mayo to the Western Isles. In the medieval galley known as the Eilidh, he was really reconstructing the world of the Lordship of the Isles. That was a maritime kingdom that held sway on the west coast of Scotland in the Middle Ages, a sort of Gaelic Nordic kingdom founded in effect by the great seafaring warrior Somerled, whom my father greatly admired. As crew for the galley, Wallace was able to select some lifelong friends.
So we did a hell of a lot of research into all sorts of ships before coming up with the design for the Eilidh, which I was very lucky to be asked to join for part of that trip. It started off in the west of Ireland, and I was there. I was there first of all at the launch, and I went to see Wallace in the boatyard in Moville when it was being built. And it's funny to see it in its basic shape, a huge vessel, and then the thrill of having it launched at Moville, and then the thrill of crewing it, where Miles' son, Wallace's son, was one of the crew on that, and I would hop into Miles was a photographer as well as a writer and other things, so I would hop into the rubber boat and I would ferry him ashore so that he could climb a hill and take photographs of the galley around various headlands, and then he would climb down again and I would bring him back to the galley.
Thanks to Wallace's partners in the Lord of the Isles project, the MacDonald clan of Skye, the galley would later make even more distinguished voyages as far afield as the Faroes. And to Wallace's delight, the galley also stimulated interest in traditional Scottish boat building, such as Gal Gael, a respected community project in the Govan district of Glasgow. Wallace was fascinated by all the links between the north coast of Ireland and the west coast of Scotland. Strategic connections, human connections, commercial connections, and above all, Christian and spiritual connections. And those spiritual connections also mean a lot to Robin Ruddock, who's the new owner and steward of Wild Goose.
And the significance of the Wild Goose for me is in her name as well, not just the fact that she's a historic vessel in her own right, but that's the symbol of the Holy Spirit in the early Christian Celtic Church. So it's really nice to have a vessel come into your responsibility, and it is just I do see this as being, I'm the custodian. Wallace was a custodian for many years in his family, and the boat has moved on now through the Causeway Coast Maritime Heritage Group into our family, and we'll certainly do our best to maintain and improve and look after her.
People often said about Wallace that he had an earthly side to his character and a spiritual side.
There were times when I disappeared to my cabin after dinner. So Wallace and the boys and the visiting men had all their ribald conversations. I know he was quite spiritual. It's a feeling you get rather than anything that's expressed in words. He would talk about deeper things and feelings.
One Sunday in church, you know, when I think the service had already started, but the door opened and in comes Wallace Clark in Wellingtons, having walked from Bunagee after coming in and never bothered changing and didn't have his shoes with him and just came on to church with his Wellingtons on, came in and sat in a pew and involved in the service the same as everybody else. My father couldn't get over that's how casual he was, you know.
Yes, I would say, and I would say that a lot of his voyages were inspired from inside. It's something you couldn't actually put into words.
I think the two sides of Wallace came to the fore when he was at sea, especially when he was with a crew of like-minded people. When he was at sea, he felt very much close to God. I think he was in the force of nature, wind and tide. Behind me, we have the Narrows here between Portaferry and Strangford. This is where Patrick swept in so long ago round to found a church. This is where the Vikings came. Wallace was very much aware in a place like this, and we came through here in March 1963 on the Sunday morning training weekend for the Curragh crew. We came through on the flood tide, and that was my first experience of this part of the world. It was just extraordinary, and Wallace felt fully alive when he was at sea. But that meant also the spiritual side came out. He wasn't a sort of, he didn't go all sort of dead religious and talk in a hushed tone and continually use religious language. He just simply was fully alive, and in a sense, there were times when being a man of prayer actually was most visible, when he was most active as a man, as a man's man. In the middle of a bit of a blow in a small boat and dealing with that, but especially in the Curragh crew. And there were times when the voyage had its rough moments and the crew needed to pull together, and he was just the man who could hold them together and give them confidence and hope. They did trust him enormously in terms of his seamanship, and the spiritual side, the spiritual prowess somehow just seemed to flow from that.
But I'm glad to say that that voyage in 1963 was not the last modern effort to reconstruct the world of the Apostle of Scotland. In fact, much more recently, the Causeway Coast Maritime Heritage Group built a Curragh and carried out another reconstruction voyage to reproduce the historic voyage of the Irish-born Apostle of Scotland, which was made by tradition in 563. You allow yourselves a few modern aids, probably, that St Columba wouldn't have had.
Yeah, if we get into trouble, we have to have a backup, especially when sometimes we don't have a support vessel. So we have what we like to call the Iron Monk to pull us out of trouble if we have difficulties next to shore. But generally we try to do everything as natural as possible with oars.
And that vessel, the Column Kill, is still plying the Irish and Scottish waters, and in that sense the tradition of Wallace Clark and the revival of the Columba legacy is still very much a work in progress. I said that Rathlin was a very, very important stepping stone for Wallace. It was the first island that he sailed to. It was where he received a few lessons in sailing. It was the subject of his first full-length book on maritime history. So Rathlin always had a very special place in his heart. And it seems entirely appropriate that a book about his sailing adventures over 60 years was launched on Rathlin Island by publishers who have their base on Rathlin Island, Rathlin Island Books. So on a summer's day, when the newly published book Call of the Running Tide is doing some brisk business, and when the Curragh, the Column Kill, is sailing out of Rathlin Harbour, I think we can say that the spirit of Wallace Clark is very much alive and living in Rathlin and many other places too.